We're now going to go on to a discussion panel of the regulatory role title challenges of advanced practice across the 4 countries. So Bev's going to join us on that panel, but I'd like to introduce the other panel members as well. We have joining us Dr. Luella Vaughan, who is a consultant physician at the Royal London Hospital. Luella has led the consultation for the NMC independent report into advancing practice. We have Nia Borton, who is a consultant nurse for primary care at BCU in Wales. Nia was the key author on the Advancing Practice Framework for Wales. We have also Dr. Mark Cooper, who's a consultant nurse in Greater Glasgow in Clyde. Mark was the deputy chair for the Transforming Roles work on advancing practice in Scotland. And we also have Dr. Andrew Radley, consultant in public health pharmacy at NHS Tayside in Scotland. And Andrew is also a reader at the University of Dundee at medical school. So it's fantastic to have you all with us, representation across the 4 countries. So I'm going to move to the discussion. I think this should be really, really rich discussion. So I'll hand over to Colette, one of my AAPE colleagues, to ask the first question.
Thanks, Diane. So first question is to Bev. How will regulation impact public perception of advanced practice roles?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be a bit like a broken record, I imagine, over this piece. It's going to come down to what we do and how we do it. And so I think the challenges, going back to my point of the presentation, is that the average patient connecting with services trust the person they are seeing is good enough to do what they need done. And they trust that somebody else has made that choice and that decision. And so for me, the impact of regulation has to be to offer the assurance to the employer that from a regulatory perspective, the person they are seeing is good enough. How we choose to do that will be down to the work that happens over the next 2 years. And I'm not in a position to second guess or offer a personal opinion on that. That's outside of my role here today. But from a public perspective, as I say, when I take my beautiful mum to go see whoever I'm seeing, I don't quiz that person until I realise that I'm not quite sure what they are, whether I'm happy with what they're doing. Then I will quiz them very, very ferociously about their ability to be making the decisions that they may be making. The average member of the public perhaps doesn't have the privilege I have of knowing the underpinning of advanced practice. So I think the challenge for me is that whatever happens with regulation, if we were able to achieve a common narrative across, as I say, countries, regulators, profession bodies and stakeholders about a very clear steer on advanced practice and a very clear steer for the public on educating them about it in the assurance that that is well governed by trusts, by organisations and within the scope of the regulator, then we get to a point, I believe, where the public can have that confidence without feeling the need to interrogate the person that is looking after themselves or their loved one. So I think it's a really difficult one, because for public confidence, we've got to make sure this is a well understood and well managed piece, but it's far more than just regulation for me. So I appreciate that's probably not the answer many people would want to hear, but that for me, that's the pragmatism of where a patient is hitting this agenda from, as a patient and a carer.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bev. The next question is to Andrew. So, hi, Andrew. What are the challenges of all of the professional statutory regulatory boards working together to agree regulation?
Thank you very much. I think in theory we should have a common basis for working together. All of our jobs are about protecting the public. We all want to see safe and effective care. We need the public to have trust in the professions. All of that makes us secure and safe in what we do. And what's more, we share the 4 pillars of professional practice. Patient care, leadership, education, research are the underpinning basis for how we practice. And there's many similarities between all of the professions. And so with that common basis, we should have a common language for moving forward. More than that, though, for instance, some of our research in pharmacy has shown that to meet the competency standards for advanced practice, pharmacists need to develop leadership and research skills, and working in the University of Dundee alongside Colette has shown some similar findings for the AHPs as well. In some of our ongoing work, we've brought the different professional consultant practitioners together, and it's striking how common the language is between us and about all the things that we share. So with all of these things, with common challenges in terms of achieving advanced practice, but with a shared underpinning basis for our practice, I think that this should be a thing that can be achieved working together.
Brilliant. Thank you
Andrew.
so much.
Thanks. Sorry, Diane. I'm going to ask the next question to Naya, first of all. Does devolution impact on how governance is managed?
Thank you, Colette. And I think the short answer is yes, it does. And I just want to pick up on one of the points that I caught Bev making at the end there, that idea of unity and standardisation that comes from that kind of centrally governed focus versus the flexibility and the richness that comes from devolution. And there needs to be a balance struck from that, I think, and it needs to be proportionate. And dare I say it too, a hint of healthy competition between the four nations isn't necessarily a bad thing too. I don't know, Mark, do you want to come in? I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
On the competition between the four nations.
Not just that bit.
No, I mean, I think, looking back a few years, the Commission on Devolution in Scotland, back in, I think it was 2009, suggested that professional regulation should stay at a UK level, so that, patients understood exactly what they were getting, and also facilitate some of the movement between the different countries. And I think that's a good thing, and particularly with some of the decisions that have been made recently, freedom of movement is a bit curtailed. Wouldn't want to see that curtailed anymore. However, we do have some differences between the different countries at the moment, and I think it's good that we have a little bit of competition and sharing what's working and what perhaps hasn't worked quite so well, and more importantly, learning from each other. So I think devolution has brought some challenges in, but it's brought some opportunities, and I think on the whole it's a good thing, but we need to talk to each other, the different countries talk to each other and share and learn.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think it's about bringing together those successes, learning from the areas where each of us have struggled, and sharing that, ensuring that you've got that portability. So we've got that common narrative, I think, again, is a term that's been used this morning. Those core scope of practice that is inherently transferable across the four nations, but actually still permitting some flexibility and some richness. And I think, when we talk of devolution in its broader sense, in terms of actually the response on the ground and the ability to tailor to local population needs and the impact on reducing health inequalities, etc., advanced practice absolutely has the potential to mirror that.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Brilliant. So I'm going to ask the next question. I'll ask to Luella, if that's okay. So Luella, what are the benefits of regulation?
Well, so the primary benefit of regulation really should be the protection of the public, as Bev has already touched upon. So first of all, there's the assurance that the practitioner who is sitting in front of you is actually appropriate to do the things that they're going to do to you. And then there's the issue of redress, because the level of public confidence in the UK in all practitioners is really very high. And the assumption is that the person who is in front of you is good until something goes wrong. And so there's the issue of the mechanisms of redress and how these are addressed. And that is something that regulation might help actually to smooth and sort out. At the moment, interestingly, with advanced practice specifically, the assurances that the person who is doing the job is capable of doing the job, all of that sits with the employer at the time of employment. And so actually having specific regulation for advanced practice will allow that risk to be shared with the regulator. So at the moment, the risk for doctors is shared between the GMC and the NHS. At the moment, although the NMC does have some assurance, it isn't specific in terms of that particular role. So that will be of great use to employers. And then there's the individual practitioner, which is that you know that you are actually capable to do the job that you're being asked to do. But what we found really interesting when we did this work is that when we interviewed people, the perceived benefits didn't really relate to most of these things. That the hoped for benefits tended to be professional. That if regulation was put in place, it would somehow fix a whole lot of problems that exist in nursing. It would allow people to have longer, better careers, better pay, attract people from overseas, sort out issues around recognition, all of those sorts of things. But when we asked people, how is it going to do this? They weren't quite as clear actually on that, which is a really kind of, and it comes back to Bev's point of what regulation. In some ways, the code is actually really a very good piece of legislation. It works actually quite well. It's set up to deal with different practitioners of different types doing actually quite different jobs at different skill levels with different competencies. It's really very good. And so actually you can then range the regulation from not doing very much, tweaking it a tiny bit, through to whole scale reform. And if you did whole scale reform, that's going to take a good 10 to 15 years to take. So actually there are quite interesting questions about what the regulation is as to what the benefits would be. And I think, as Bev said, there has to be some real realism about the timelines to do this. And not everything can be sorted with regulation. There are examples of things being sorted out with agreements between health boards, employers, and actually sorting out things like pay and scope and those sorts of things. Northern Ireland is a good example of that, without actually needing any regulation at all. So this isn't just something that the NMC needs to sort out. It is, in fact, a whole professional, issue.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, that's great, thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that. Any other additions to any benefits, or I think Luella's covered that. Mark?
No, it was just really to say that our advanced practice ship has sailed a few decades ago, and I think it is right that we look at regulation, but it's not as if we're at the early stages of planning this new role, this advanced practice role, and putting education and regulation in place before it's introduced in the country, like other countries have done, like Ireland and New Zealand and Australia. We've started. We're well underway, and bringing in any changes is going to require a sort of retrofit at sea, which is going to be very complex and potentially costly as well with that. And we've got some real challenges as well. We've got multi-professional roles. What do we do with the advanced practitioners that are the pioneers of the role, that are trained many years ago with their experience, and sort of grandfathering them in? Do we just focus on the generalist ANP role? What about the specialist? What about the level of practice above the consultant level? What about the level of practice below the senior practitioner level? We've got lots and lots of challenges. That's just some of them. There's more. So we've got to be very careful about doing this. I think it's right that we head on the road towards regulation, but we are in a different place because advanced practices started so many years ago in the UK.
Brilliant, thank you. Luella, I can see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right that if you're going to, if the UK was going to do a really good job of, like a really easier job of this, it should have started, a good 15 years ago. But it is worth noting that advanced practice started in the US back in the 1960s, and they still do not have consistent legislation across all of their jurisdictions in the US. So, and that's 60 years. So this is a journey, and it's a long and arduous, but I think it's a move overall in the right direction.
Brilliant, thank you. Andrew, do you want to come in?
Yeah, please. I really like Bev's point about governance and regulation. And for me, regulation's the baseline standard, the minimum standard, and on top of that we build our governance that sets our aspirations and sets the infrastructure to allow people to practice. And so regulation won't answer all of our questions, but governance might.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Lots and lots of, like you say, lots to think about, isn't there? That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Colette for the next question. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. So this question is to Bev. Could regulation hamper advanced practice development?
Thank you, Anna. Back to my broken record. It depends how we do it. So I remember a conversation I had with department colleagues when we were looking at the beginnings of the regulatory reform work around the opportunities, some of the reform opportunities around the ability to add different annotations or credentials, whatever we might want to call them. And I think there's a real responsibility for us. And there's a huge piece here around professional stewardship that I tried to touch on through my presentation, which is so much of what we're doing is a natural evolution of scope of practice. Remember, the thermometer was such a complex piece of equipment when it was invented. The story goes that only a doctor could use it. Well, we've come a long way since then, and I'd argue that is a silly story, but it underpins the work that we're doing. So you look at radiography at the moment. We have, by the nature of the fact that we are working very well together across the profession on the stewardship of the profession, the conversations playing through in radiography about how we advance the profession and what used to be advanced practice becomes enhanced level practice. Now that we have a thing that we can structurally attach things to, it gives us the ability to evolve the profession in a way that we cannot lose through regulation. And it would be the most sad moment if we pin the professions down to the floor in a point where we cannot evolve, where we get to a point where employers say, well, I'm really sorry, Beverly, you've got the credential for working on a Thursday, but you don't have the credential for working on a Friday. So therefore you can't work on a Friday because you don't have that credential. And you could see a point where if we are not incredibly mindful in how we establish any form of regulatory construct beyond the fact that I am already a registrant and I already have to work within my scope of practice, we need to be really mindful of the foreseen and unforeseen consequence of doing that. And it doesn't mean that there aren't regulatory tools available to us. There are. And again, read the Nuffield report. It lays out for you a variety of different interventions that are possible. But the issue for us is that we have got to create a nimble, flexible approach to advancing practice that can stand the test of time and that can ensure that employers, and I totally respect and live in the world of the balance between flexibility and safety. I totally respect that. The issue for us, though, there is a sweet spot. We need to find that sweet spot. So going back to the conversation with the department, where we got to in an incredibly energetic and excitable conversation, I should say, too, was what on earth does one regulate? Does one regulate the level of practice? And what you'll see in England is what we've got done is using the framework. And it's not regulation, it's educational assurance. We're very clear about that, and we have a very clear understanding with our regulators what we do and don't do. But we have pinned it down to the core middle ground that we all share to illustrate the level of clinical reasoning, expertise, and that whole sort of whatever diagnostic case management, whatever the scope of practice you have is, we've anchored it in that space. We have not anchored it in, and so therefore what do you do? And we will have the credentials as a way of supporting service transformation and service movement. But the minute we start regulating credentials, I argue we're getting to an incredibly difficult place because we then start to pin down practice in a way that I don't know we want to. So I am absolutely delighted by the fact that we have got a real pause and think moment, and I'm going to exploit every single minute of that time to test and to think and to support the narrative so that we end up in the right place.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to highlight to colleagues, Anne has kindly typed into the chat box, provided the link for the Nuffield report there. So please do have a look at that as well. I'm handing over to Diane.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark for the next question, Mark and Nia, but I'll start with Mark. So Mark, what would your ideal solution be to the issue of surrounding the role, title, ambiguity, okay, and variability? So let me say that again. So I want to get my language right. Okay, what would your ideal solution be to the issues surrounding role, title, ambiguity, and variability? Thank you. I'm going to leave you with that one.
No problems. I don't know what my ideal solution would be. I think probably one of the questions is the role title. Yes, I think we would like to see it much clearer. What an advanced practitioner is, but what title are we talking about? Are we talking about advanced practitioner, advanced clinical practitioner, advanced nurse practitioner, advanced paramedic practitioner? Yeah, we need to be very clear about that first of all. I think over the last few years, we're getting greater clarity across each of our countries in terms of the education requirements for that, the competencies, knowledge, skills, and behaviours that are required for the role. We perhaps have got a little bit more work to do around there to get complete consistency around that. But I think for me, that's one of the questions about, which title is it that we're talking about here? Which one are we looking to protect? Bearing in mind that nurse isn't a protected title in the UK. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful around that.
Yeah, thank
And
you, Mark. Nia, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Much to echo, I think, what Mark has said, that we need to be clear exactly which aspects we are talking about here when we're talking about regulation, and the title in particular. I think we're much closer, even in the just last 3 years in Wales, which is where I'm based. We've now got ourselves to a situation where we define much more clearer what we mean by enhanced, advanced and consultant level practice. But of course, it's not black and white. Lots of shades of grey along that too, and lots of overlap, and it's a continuum that you move up and down. So there's further work to be done there. First and foremost, I think there's a consistency of underpinning education, again allowing for some of that richness and flexibility, I think is key too. So yeah, I think the other point to mention, and I know that colleagues both in Scotland and England and Ireland are each doing this, but we've evolved a ratification kind of process for advanced practice too, that allows us to have some jurisdiction over that role usage. Again, we've by no means got this licked, far from it, but we've got some form now of scrutiny over people's advanced practice portfolios and their scope of practice that allows them to have that validation and therefore use the title and a way of annexing that on their ESR, on their staff records. So we've got a form of regulation, just an informal one, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, and just to come in on that, sorry, I was just going to say,
Carry on.
Nia and I were talking the other day about the process they've got in Wales and processes we have in Scotland for reviewing individuals' portfolios and recording them using the national workforce systems that we have in both countries. So we've got some of that going on. We've been looking at new advanced practitioner portfolios for the last 3.5 years, and I was looking to see, out of all of our advanced nurse practitioners that I have in my board, which is just over 200, we now have 100 of them have got portfolios in place that meet the minimum requirements that the employer has identified need to be in place for that. So there's quite a lot of work that is going on in different areas. We need to try and draw that together and build on that to move forward.
And just to kind of conclude, sorry, but picking up on a point which I noted in the chat bar earlier, is that, again, for us in Wales, we've been very focused on advanced clinical practice and not necessarily of other forms of advanced practice as we may recognise them across the other three pillars. So actually those that aren't maybe hands-on or directly patient-facing, but are absolutely advancing practice across research or education. How are we capturing that? How does that format work for them as well? I think is quite important, and we haven't yet got a proper grip on that.
Great, thank you. Luella, did that raise your answer your point? I've raised your hand.
No,
yeah.
So I was just going to make a slightly separate point on this, which is that as we've just heard, other jurisdictions have actually gone quite some way to smoothing and sorting this out. The problem is with the employers in England. There are workforce shortages, and there is also a shortage of money, and so people want a cheap, quick workforce. And we have heard stories, unfortunately. So we look properly at the job adverts, and the job adverts having the words advanced or advanced in the job practice. The range was absolutely staggering, and the pay ranged from I think a 3C all the way up to a band 9. And there was absolutely no consistency in the way that the titles were used, nor in the job descriptions, nor in the pay. Now, the employers, so NHS England could in fact actually sort this out tomorrow, and it could be enforced through the CQC and other regulators. And so this is a problem about the massive workforce shortages that we have. And the funding shortfalls that we have. And at the moment, it is in fact incumbent on employers to fix this. That it was fixed in Northern Ireland through the employers, and it could be done tomorrow if they so desire. We don't actually need regulation to fix it, but it really is it's a problem, and it's a problem for the public, and it's also a problem for the people who are doing the jobs. It's not fair.
Thank you, everyone.
Totally agree with you, Luella. It's a huge problem, and the use of titles is such an issue, really, isn't it? So I'm going to go to Andrew next and ask you on that point. Maintaining identity to one's original base discipline is important to many. How do you feel regulation of advanced practice will allow this identity to remain?
Okay, so I mean, the first thing to point out, and everyone knows this, is about the large overlap between the professions and the knowledge, skills, and behaviours, as Mark said, that are required for advanced practice. There's lots and lots that draw us together. We've got lots of commonality, and there's lots of common activities, things that we do in our daily work, in our practice, that are all undertaken right across the board. So, assessment of patients, prescribing, provision of care, that are very similar. But the interesting point here is how we recognise and develop each profession's unique contribution. So that's the important bit. How do we strengthen the provision of care? How do we support each other to provide the best care possible for patients? And that's because of our unique contribution. And so I'm a pharmacist. I'm proud to be a pharmacist. And what we do is use medicines to improve health. We've got a thing in pharmacy that says we use medicines, the purposive prescription of medicines to improve a person's quality of life. And that's our unique contribution. And so for me, using I'll come back to these 4 pillars again. The way that we maintain our identity is by undertaking education and undertaking research as part of our practice. And so there's probably nothing clearer about maintaining your professional identity than describing and explaining what you do about being a pharmacist, in my case, to student, and to help to shape and define professional identity. So explaining what your practice is and teaching and being that role model is a really good way to understand what your unique contribution is. And again, I said about research, thinking about how to use your practice to improve patient outcomes, develop the profession, and that's kept me quite solidly grounded in being a pharmacist. So these activities need to be part of regulation, I would say. So we need evidence for people that they are undertaking these activities and that they have a balanced role, and that this is the way that they get to their professional identity.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll hand back over to you, Diane.
Brilliant, thank you. Hi, next question for Bev. Hi, Bev. Do you think that regulation will generate and maintain a place in the current workforce, ensuring sustainability of the advanced practice role?
It depends how we do it, I think it's fair to say, because if we make it draconian and it comes down to the fact that I can only work on a Thursday if I have the credential to work on a Thursday, then we've killed it. The employers will work around it and we'll go off into the world of the super specialists, the whatever we want to call it, Fred, whatever. There will be another workforce created that does this thing. And Luella's hit the nail on the head for me, which is whatever your country, whatever your financial situation, there is a belief that this can give us a highly skilled workforce on the cheap. And my one narrative in every environment is you get what you train, basically. And if we support and train people to be able to undertake the diagnostic level of clinical reasoning, and we train people to know more about their specialty, every profession tells me, oh no, Beverly, you don't understand. Sorry, you don't understand. We're advanced practitioners at birth. When we graduate, we're advanced practitioners, Beverly. And I have to say, no, you're not. You are wonderful. You're brilliant. You are so special. Yes, you may have done a post-registration master's degree. You may have done something fantastic. You are a novice as you emerge into the clinical environment. Unless you are of another profession who's come into that profession, you may move faster. But whatever happens, in the context of your professional journey, you enter the workforce as a novice. And we must be really respectful and mindful of that. Love and nurture those people. Allow them to move at the pace that they are able to with the right support. But we have got to be really clear with people that to achieve the level of practice that we need to make decisions that are good enough for my mum, who is the most complex person on the planet, they've got to be good enough. And that means that they've got to not only, and you'll hear Deborah Harding, who is incredible, talk this afternoon. It's not just the education is the beginning of a journey. It's the education, it's the clinical supervision that happens whilst you are learning. And then once you graduate from your master's program, what happens in practice to help you continue to deal with the ambiguity, the challenge, the first times, everything that you come across, so that you continue to grow as a clinician and get better. I'll bring us back to the fact we train a GP for 10 years to become a general practitioner, and they would only just be beginning to learn really to be a general practitioner at that point. We are of different professions, and we're very proud of those different professions. You cannot make us to the level of somebody we take a decade training with the most fantastically well-funded and orchestrated training program. I don't know about you guys. I graduated from university and hiccuped around a profession, making my own way through, doing a bit of learning, some weekend courses. I built my knowledge and skills, did my masters, and moved through. No structure, no supervisor, no director of medical education, nobody to support me on that journey. I made it up as I went, and I was good and I was safe, but it was not a structured educational development program. So we are taking a workforce who has had very little investment and very little structural training into an advanced practice role, often quite early these days in their clinical career. And therefore, if we don't get the regulation bit right, yes, I know it will help everything else, but actually we also run the risk of paralysing something, creating workarounds, and we go right back to where we started with the advanced practice agenda. And we're on a journey now where the world is realising that you can't do this on the cheap. You've got to do this to a level of skill, a level of understanding. So if we are really clever, the regulatory construct, the work with CQC, and the work the Nuffield Trust has given us. And Luella, I want you to come to our conference in November, and I want you to tell the world everything that you've got in your head on the basis of what you've been seeing in the report, because I want to spend time with you, Luella. It's fantastic. But the challenge to us now is the regulation must wrap around the developments that all 4 countries have made, and it must drive us forward, and its aim must be to stabilise it so the employers do use it, do want it. It should put advanced practice on its feet, upright, and then move it forwards. The risk is we don't. The risk is we kill it, and we end up with a workaround. And so that's our professional challenge, which is why I beg you, please, to suspend belief on what you think until you've done the thinking and heard the arguments, and then work with where we end up. Because we have got to create sustainability of advanced practice safely and appropriately. So we end up with structural training. And that's why we've worked so hard in England to put in place the enhanced practice level and the consultant practice level. I know you have in other countries, but that was always our mission, was to create structural training. So people don't end up in advanced practice too early. They build their skill set, they build their expertise, and then we get the right people with the right skills and the right grounding into advanced practice in a way that will ensure sustainability of advanced practice. As colleagues have said, the regulation, if we get it right, is the I think Mark called it the foundation. I think that should be our basis, but everything else should stand strongly on the top of it rather than it be the only thing. I hope that answered the question.
That's brilliant, thank you. And Mark, do you want to come in?
Sorry, Dan, could I just add
that
Katrina's just stuck something on Twitter, which is also sums up is we must at no point let the employer off the hook here for their level of governance and their responsibility and their part of this. So I think that we've really got to keep that far greater 360-degree perspective here on self, employer, and regulator. The risk here is everybody's looking for the regulator to solve it. They can't. However brilliant they are, they can't solve this problem. We only solve it in that combined community of all of us together, as per my slide of that massive list of people who've all got a slice of responsibility here. Sorry. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Bev. Mark, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I was going to comment on one point, but I'll just pick up on that second point about the employer. I think the employer's got a huge responsibility and mustn't be let off the hook, but they need support to do it, and there needs to be agreement between the employers about what they're looking for, because there's variation there at the moment, particularly when you get down to the very small employers like individual GP practices and others. But I just wanted to pick up on the point Bev made about a career structure, and I think that's really important at the moment. I think we've probably got it a bit wrong, because we sort of train advanced practitioners from scratch over a 2-year period and expect them to get up to advanced practice within that fairly short period of time, whereas it should be a much longer trajectory where they're supported all the way through. We train them up, from a level 5 practitioner to a level 6, working in a sort of nurse practitioner or clinical nurse specialist role, and then take them up to advanced practitioner afterwards. And I think that gives a bit of a challenge to our university colleagues to think about our existing programs and how they may need to evolve to prepare that the level below that senior practitioner level before moving on to advanced practice. In Scotland, there's some work done recently around clinical nurse specialist roles that people might be interested in having a look at, and that's the 8th paper in the Transforming Roles series, Transforming Roles Paper 8. It's around clinical nurse specialists, but it looks at the 2 levels of practice, and I think that's useful to play into the conversation around that sort of career pathway, the career trajectory.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Andrew, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to make some points about regulation. I mean, we think it's a good thing. It creates profile and understanding of advanced practice roles. It builds confidence and trust, and it helps to shape expectations of professional competence. But the bit that's kind of missing for me is about the involvement of the public. In public health, we often say nothing about us without us. And I suppose I'd like to understand what the public's role is in shaping this. At the moment, it seems to be a conversation with ourselves and doesn't have that perspective about what the public's view would be. And I think that just as in research now, we know that we have to have patient involvement in the design of research. It strikes me that we have to have patient involvement in the design of regulation and not just a professional matter.
Thank you. That's a good point. Yeah, thank you so much. Ania, do you want to come in?
Yes, please, if I might. And I'm conscious I don't maybe want to take us too far away from what the original question was, but I just want to pick up on a point that Bev's made, and also that links back to what Andrew was saying before around this concept of being defined in a medical model, really. And I think it is a real issue for us in advanced practice that often many advanced practice roles, especially the early ones, evolved out of a medical workforce deficit. They were funded off a medical line, and then training was provided by medics. And also, if we're really honest and vulnerable about this as nurses too, I think we've actively sought some of that validation, that concept again that we are good enough and we should be recognised in this way, and we would like to be respected in the way that we often see our medical colleagues, that we've pushed some of that agenda too. And there is an issue for us now, because actually, just as Bev is very beautifully articulated, we're not medics. I have no intention of being a medic. That's not my aim. I'm a nurse. My superpower is my communication, my ability to build rapport and trust with my patients, to support them to make the right health choices, to make their lives better. Just as Andrew is saying that as a pharmacist, he brings medicines to the party. We each bring something different. And I don't think we've quite got to the point of truly understanding and articulating that yet. And until we truly get a grip of that, then actually regulation can impede this development massively. So there's something for me about a backward step at the moment, not allowing some of the Royal Colleges, the medical Royal Colleges, to define us, because that is absolutely what's happening in terms of our chem portfolios, etc. What does this mean to me as a nurse in advanced practice? And when I understand that, then regulation and standardisation can fall out of that more naturally.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Bev first and then Luella. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I could not agree more. We have got to do the discipline on the thinking. And I think there are two things that help us here. The first thing is that the medical associate practitioner's agenda was a huge part of that confusion. And I totally agree with you. It isn't just nursing that sought the recognition of medics. Everybody does it in their different ways through the work that they've done. And I think that's exactly where it started. And, you know, as I say, some of the funding does come from the medical line, and medical needs to sort some of its workforce challenges. And I think the issue for us is that now that we've got the courage of, for example, the advanced clinical practitioners in critical care who have moved away from the medical associate practitioner family and into the advanced practice family, that's been a very helpful statement of we are nurses, we are physios, we are ODPs, and we work in an ACCP role. Amazing, fantastic. We do both. We are not medical substitutes. And the minute anybody thinks that we are, it's dangerous because I'm not a doctor. I can't do the breadth and depth of clinical anything that a doctor can do. I'm me, I'm Beverly, I'm the physiotherapist. I can do my scope of practice. And that's part of the opportunity and the challenge. But if you remember all the challenges of early days of this, are you going onto a medical rota? Are you going onto a clinical rota? What we never did was the workforce transformation that says we're not role substituting medics. And I'm channeling my inner Alison Leary today. You must forgive me. I do have my own thoughts, I promise you. But Alison always said to me was that in the early days, we were trying to work through what is the language here and it's not about role substitution. We are redistributing the workload around a team that enables us to play to the strength of the team, which is why I maintain that most of the advanced practice work that we do is an extension of our original and our modern scope of practice. When you think what the nurse ward sister has always done throughout her entire lifetime, with every junior doctor, with every new registrar on the ward, they've taught, supported, loved, done it. They just haven't had the respect of the training and the pay and the position that goes with it. We've got to totally rethink, as you rightly say. This is modernisation of modern teams, utilising the skills of everybody, understanding better. We don't even know what each other does, let alone this scope of practice opportunity of what each of us can do. Get over ourselves, respect each other, build modern teams. And interestingly, we've had some real challenges with working, and we work brilliantly with our medical royal colleges. We really do respect totally. We understand that the challenge of delegation and for them, the mindset. The issue for us, though, is that we set up in England the Centre for Advancing Practice so that we could broker the decisions about what a credential might look like outside of a medical royal college. Clearly, FICM and RChem have their work and it's established, we respect it. But for the future, we didn't want to be doing it that way. We wanted to do it together, meeting eyeball to eyeball as equal partners. I want to meet my medical colleagues eyeball to eyeball. And I want to broker what is a modern deployment of our skills in this environment, not what did we used to do when the registrar did this work or whatever it might be. So I think there's I totally agree. We've got to do a fundamental stop and rethink so we don't regulate the wrong thing. We've got to regulate us as who we are and what we do and allow us to value our shared activities and our unique activities and really prize our Venn diagram overlap and not all try and become one big sludge. It would be the biggest patient safety risk we could possibly manage. And that means we don't all prescribe. It means we don't all do physical examination. It means we all do something different based on what we are doing in our job role. And we create fundamental unsafeness if we try and create uber standardization because we're training people to do the wrong things. They've got to train to do what they need to do to exercise their advanced level practice in their area. So again, thank you. I completely agree with you. Sorry, Luella.
No, so I was just going to say that in the interviews, this was one of the biggest fault lines. So there were those who were like Alison, who are absolutely adamant about the specialness of nursing as opposed to the other disciplines, and that the need to utterly to preserve this. And then the others who were completely on the other side of the fence. And in fact, actually, the notion that advanced practice, because it begins to slide into task shifting and adopting a much more medical model, that is in fact the reason for the need for regulation, because you are no longer practicing as something that is just a nurse as you were trained. You are doing something that is different. And the whole advocacy for the change or additional layer of regulation hinged on that. And so I think, as Bev said, that's a really important intellectual point that the profession needs to get to grips with. And it's not for me to dictate what I'm a doctor, it's not for me to dictate what you do or don't do about this. But I think it's absolutely an absolutely key fault line. And unless this is properly addressed and bridged, the regulation will not serve. And you might as well just have what you have at the moment, frankly, which, as I said, is actually quite a good piece of regulation anyway.
Thank you so much of everyone for contributions to that. Lots to do and lots to think about there. So I'm going to hand over to Colette now for the next question.
Thanks, Diane. I just feel like adding my 10 pence worth into the discussion as well before I go to the next question. So totally agree with what you're saying. And, you know, for me, for a profession to advance as a profession, you need to be leading that, and we need to be breaking some of the ties whilst we maintain that good working relationships with everybody. Some of the terminology that we use, non-medical prescribing, some of the assessments that we use, such as OSCE assessments, some of the mini-KECs, they've all originated from our medical colleagues. And I think we need to look at that, because we can't always just lift something and apply it to another profession, as we've been discussing today. So great discussions, thank you. So my next question is going to be to Bev. So if NMC regulation progresses, how will this impact our advanced practice, HCPC and General Pharmaceutical Council colleagues?
Brilliant. Thank you so much indeed. So from the absolute beginnings of time, we have met with our regulators and worked with our regulators to understand what we do in relation to what they do and how we stay sort of in the right space together. With Sam coming into the NMC, I've got absolute, and I had before, I mean, Anne and I have worked together, I've got absolute faith in the fact that the NMC are very, very clearly here. They serve nursing midwifery. They are a fantastic body for the professions. They're also creatures who work incredibly well in a multi-professional space. The regulators meet very regularly together. They work together. They do bits of underpinning work together. They did all the prescribing activities and work together, taking on distributed leadership. In this instance, clearly the Pharmaceutical Council did the work around the prescribing, and the other professions came together, the other regulators, came together to do that work. So they have a very well-seasoned way of working and operating together. But clearly they each work with for their communities. Everybody is cited on the challenge of what happens if we move in a unilateral direction with any one of the regulators. And the challenges are many and varied. The challenges are for employers. It means that we will have chaos in England if we had a unilateral regulation. We also understand that from a regulatory perspective, it then impacts on people's ability to earn, to progress. You can imagine what happens next with a multi-professional cohort of employees when one profession is regulated, the rest aren't. We've created immediately a two-tier environment, and we are not sophisticated enough in our management of our workforce to understand that and work with that ambiguity. We can't do it. We will distill down to, it'll be the most fantastic moment to, move advanced practice purely into one professional camp, but that is not what the population needs. It's not what service needs. And it's not appropriate for a whole workforce solution. So we are working incredibly closely. I'm meeting the HCPC on Tuesday. I see them regularly. We have got the work happening. So Sam Foster, I was in email communication with her this week. They meet with colleagues next week to continue the discussions here. There's an active ongoing dialogue behind the scenes. And I have confidence and faith that they are expert regulators working together, that they will find a way through this together, and we will work to support that. When I contacted Sam in the week, I also commented on the fact that we had been about to start our Four Nation conversations before merger distracted us, and that we were going to restart that work. And was she happy that we restarted that work in a way that was collegiate and supportive of the work the NMC is doing? Absolutely. She's incredibly hopeful that we will continue to work together with the regulators, with professional bodies, with yourselves as leaders in the professions across the different countries, to come to a point of that real shared dialogue that colleagues have all spoken about today, working better together, talking better together, solving our challenges together, to start to get through some of the early stage work that will be needed, whether we do or don't progress to a different level of regulation. So we will work incredibly closely together to make sure that we're doing the right thing. The challenge will be timing. If there is a decision to make any form of change, and we mustn't forget that the regulation does feel and look a little bit different between the regulators anyway, and so therefore we need to understand, and each profession needs to do its thinking about what it means for them too, And so the work that as allied health lead I'm doing this year, I think I touched on the presentation with my professions, is with the 15 professions, we're doing a fundamental review of scope of practice to make sure that we are totally 21st century facing, a review of indemnity to make sure that the indemnity underpins the modern scope of practice, and then we layer on the top of that the legal constraints or the practice constraints of what people can do in service. So we end up with a very clear perspective on our starting point. And I think for the professions who are like midwifery, one of the reasons why the HCPC results were quite so middle of the road was because for the professions who are autonomous on graduation, who are working in private practice, doing this work anyway from a very early stage in their career, they can't work out what on earth we're talking about. You know, from a physio perspective, I think, well, I'm regulated. I have to evidence my clinical professional ability in the context of the role that I do. I can't understand why I would want to regulate something because I am regulated already. So there's a real challenge, I think, for some of the professions in achieving a middle ground that's going to be proportionate, pragmatic and appropriate and drive patient safety. So we've got to work through all of that with the different professional groupings. I think pharmacy will be in a very similar position on having to do its own piece of thinking. Of course, the HCPC looks after healthcare science and psychology as well. So, and of course, we've got the General Optical Council as well. We must not forget our optometrists and our dispensing opticians in this space too, because they are able to advance their practice. And you look at the high street changes in eye health, believe me, they're going to hold the first line triage of all eye health referrals in the future, I have no doubt. So we've really got to do some collaborative work together, working through the weeds of this whilst the NMC is doing its work. And hopefully we can do a lot of it together and in our professional groupings. I hope that makes sense. It's just incredibly present in our minds at the moment of the housekeeping that still needs to be done in this agenda.
Yeah, does make sense. Thank you so much, Bev. So next question is to Mark and Naya. If NMC regulation progresses, how do you think the challenges of migration to the register with the range of qualifications, experience, titles could be assimilated and managed? So a nice easy one for you to think about.
Right. I think you know, we do need to think about the pioneers and in the role that you know, have been practicing for many years, and that, you know, need to have appropriate grandfathering in for them, and they've already jumped through an awful lot of hoops. So we need to try and align the hoops that they have jumped through with the regulation requirements, so they're not having to do, you know, additional things on top of that. So I think it needs to be managed very carefully. I think I heard a figure of 5,000 advanced practitioners in England. We've got you know, 1,000 in Scotland, and I don't know how many in Wales and Northern Ireland. So there's quite a lot of folk out there that would potentially fall within those categories, and many of them won't have done the advanced practice courses that we now have across the UK. So it would need to be done very carefully and sensitively, and it will be a challenge.
And I think
Thanks,
they'd need
Mark.
to be, sorry, I was just going to extend that. Agree with Mark entirely. There'd need to be an extensive lead-in time for this. I think there's possibly scope to use some of the ratification boards that we've got set up, at least in Wales, to allow a kind of kite marking, whatever we might term it, that draws a bit of a line in the sand, brings a bit of evaluation and agrees that they're working at that level and allows that assimilation. And then obviously you have that line that everyone joining thereafter with their new advanced practice qualifications is subject to the standard approach then.
Thanks, Naya. I'll hand over to you, Diane. Oh, sorry, Luella, would you like to come in?
Yeah, so just briefly, so this internationally, and frankly, this is really the kicker in all of this. It takes a long time. It's extremely expensive. And if you get it wrong, it can create enormous problems down the road. So a good example of this was grandfather. So when they set up the College of General Practice in Australia, which is nearly 30 years ago, there was a subtle difference for those people who did not wish to go onto the GP register. and there was change, and it was absolutely fine. If you were working as a GP, you can continue to work as a GP. Those new people coming on were then registered as GPs. But then they introduced differentials in charging through the Medicare fee. And then years later, we now have an enormous problem because those people who are coming up to retirement are leaving early because there's no point in them continuing to work because of the differential in pay. And there's all sorts of major issues with this. And consistently, when you look at it, organisations, regulators, or whoever it is, massively underestimate the amount of time, effort, and expense that this will take. It's years, and it's going to be really hard, and it's going to be really, really expensive because there are potentially quite a lot of advanced practitioners out there. And even the ones who have the role, you'll have all sorts of other people who say, well, I think I've got the qualification, so therefore I'm going to apply, or may not apply. There are some very good people who you may deter from applying for it. But this is really where the major difficulties pragmatically are going to lie, and it should not be forgotten about.
That's lovely. Thank you. Diane.
Thank you. And that sort of leads me on to the next question, which is for Luella. So what are the challenges forecasted if regulation doesn't occur?
Well, so as I said, you don't really technically need regulation for this. The NMC's code is set up to be cross-disciplinary in terms of what happens with nursing specifically per se. The real issue is the other cross-professional problems. So, for example, the physician's assistants, associates. Sorry, my mistake. With the Royal College of Physicians, who will be shifting across to the GMC as a regulator. You could argue in a form that's a form of advanced practice, but the ways that they're being educated, the training purposes, the way that's going to be regulated are all very different. And there are questions, as have been touched on, about parity, training, choices. What you choose to do as you come into a profession when you're 17. Do you look at it and think, well, I could be a nurse, but actually, if I really want to do this thing over here, that might be a better route to go into it because it will be different. I will be acknowledged differently. So I don't think there's any threat to the profession say. The issue is, I think, much more around keeping up with the Joneses. And as Bev has touched upon, we are in the middle of a massive workforce crisis. And the NHS workforce needs to modernise. And nursing is the largest portion of the NHS workforce, and it absolutely needs to move with that.
Great, thank you. Anyone else, any other thoughts around challenges if regulation doesn't occur that would like to add? We covered that. Mark, were you going to come in? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, if regulation does occur, then there's huge challenges that will come along with that have been articulated quite well during our discussion just now. I think there are the challenges if regulation doesn't happen. We've got those just now, and we're facing those, and we are, I think, addressing those mainly through the employers at the moment, and we need to continue on down that path. So I think there's challenges both ways, and we need to recognise that and continue moving forward. We need to retrofit that ship at sea.
Thank you. Okay, so next question is from one of the delegates. It's for Luella, if that's okay. They've said that the question's not whether regulation will happen, but what will regulation look like?
Well, so the short answer to that is that it's not up for us to decide. What we did do was that we looked at a range of options, and these range from waiting to see what happens with the other professions, because as I said, the physicians' associates are kind of, and the anaesthetics set to move first. So there may in fact be some utility in waiting to see what happens with that, and then matching whatever that looks like. That would at least bring some consistency. And then in terms of other terms, there are already annotations on the register. So the register could just be annotated. That would be very light touch and might actually in fact be very useful. There's then a second tier of regulation, so that would take a bit more time, effort, and energy. And then, in fact, there's whole-scale reform of regulation. There are some quite marked anomalies that already exist within the nursing disciplines, particularly around things like health visiting, mental health nursing, so some other anomalies that sit within that, where people who are autonomous within portions of their practice are not necessarily recognised in those sorts of ways. And there's a couple of other kind of really odd bugs that sit within this. And then there's the issue of regulation really only happens once. It's only assurance at the time at which you join the register. So what needs to happen to continue to assure the public that you are keeping up to date, that you are needing to do the things that you need to do to keep up to date, all of that kind of stuff. So there is then the kind of the potential for whole-scale root and branch reform, and there would be some advantages to that. But that requires a whole lot of time, effort, and energy, and particularly, as Bev has touched upon, headspace, to really get to grips with what that might look like, and to ensure that if you're going to do that it's right, because we're still suffering. One of the problems with this, of course, is that you always think that the legislation that you put in place is right, because it's not like anybody does this quickly, and it's not often for several decades that the anomalies make themselves clear. So you run the risk that in fixing the previous rounds of anomalies, there are other things that you do just in fact make worse for the future. So all of this needs to be done cautiously, but there's a range of options, and it's up for the profession to decide.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. I'll hand over to Colette for the next question.
Thanks, Anne. So this one I'm going to ask of Mark, because I know of the work that you're doing in this area, and which you may want to share. Are we going to have a four-country approach on uniforms or no uniforms to help the public recognise advanced practice?
Yes, please. That would be rather good. I know certainly within Scotland we have a national uniform policy that applies to anybody working in the NHS, and advanced practitioners aren't differentiated. Strictly speaking, they're in the same colour uniform as a newly qualified practitioner, which is not very good for anybody. We look enviously at Wales, that also have a national uniform policy, and specialist nurses are differentiated with a different colour uniform. I think in England it's a bit more varied, and I'm not sure what the situation is in Scotland, but I think, yeah, it would be a really good thing if we could clearly differentiate advanced practitioners from their colleagues. We've got so many different anecdotal examples of where there's been issues. Usually in sort of emergency situations where it's not easy to identify the advanced practitioner, or they've been ignored and put to one side because they haven't recognised that they are an advanced practitioner. Other issues where the advanced practitioners are being interrupted all the time because they've been mistaken for a staff nurse on the ward. Yes, please, if we could have a consistent agreement about a different uniform for advanced practitioners across either the individual countries or the whole UK, that would be brilliant. I don't know what Mia's thoughts are around that.
I'll jump in if that's okay. Mainly smiling, because no conversation about advanced practice is complete without a uniform question, surely. And you referred to us in Wales there that we've got a national uniform policy, and we absolutely have, but it doesn't differentiate around specialist nurses. So the enhanced and advanced nurses both wear the same uniform at the moment, which does cause an element of confusion. We've got a separate uniform for consultant level practice. But of course, out in primary care land, where I sit, and I understand that's different to lots of other disciplines and specialities, we really grapple with the whole concept of a uniform at all, if I'm honest. And again, that level of advanced practice and my ability to work with my patients and build that trust really I think is hampered to some extent by a very starchy uniform. And if anything, we're tending towards practicing in a kind of smart, casual, own clothes approach. So, I mean, that's a whole other debate, I'm sure, and I'm not necessarily sure we want to go there. But I'm with you in terms of some consistency where a uniform is appropriate, that actually it's right and proper that comes into play once that title perhaps is aligned. And I know many of my colleagues in some of the South Wales health boards have a situation where they take their advanced practice portfolios to their ratification boards, and if successful at that point, their ESR is annotated and they're allowed to wear the official uniform of the advanced practitioner, which is slate grey in Wales.
Thank you.
That's
So
brilliant, thanks.
Thank you. So next question, I'm going to give this to Bev, if that's okay. Firstly, this is from one of the delegates. They've said that they continue to be quite concerned about the lack of clarity around the future use of ACP accreditation and its potential use in regulation. And they would be very keen to see a national position emerging on this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much indeed. So, could I just go back on the question? Is the question asking, will the work that's happening at the moment be relevant in a future world where there may be regulation? Is that?
I think that is what they're wondering, whether there's any, whether there's going to be any connection between the two. I think that's
fine. Okay.
What the questions,
So I'm going to start backwards and then move forward. So where we've tried to get to with the work that we're doing is we're trying to work, we've always said we'll try and work with the assets of the system. Boy, that's tough, I tell you, because as colleagues have said, there's so much work happening in this space already, and there has been for decades in many places. So where we've got people who are already active in that space, we're trying to work together, and we're working with people like the RCN and with the Society of College Radiographers and the Musculoskeletal Association of colleagues to be able to build on where people already have got, recognition programs in place. It's really difficult because everybody's got a slightly different starting point, but this is all part of the challenges that colleagues have alluded to about what happens next with regulation. So from an asset-based perspective, we're still moving through that. We're only, a year and a bit into that sort of recognition piece anyway. So into the future, I have no jurisdictional right to say what will happen next. We sit in a paused period of thinking this through, as you've all said. However, what I do know of the NMC and of all the other regulators is that they are very aware that this is one huge undertaking. If any level of regulation is required, it will be a very expensive, very large, very tricky piece of work. And what we've seen from the regulators to date is a complete openness to have conversations about all of this, because we are all exploring it together. We all hold different bits of information. We all hold different bits of the pie. So can I sit here today and tell you that what we do today will be relevant for future regulation? Of course I can't. I couldn't even begin to give you that level of assurance about anything. I can't even tell you that we will still have an NHS in 2 years' time, and please don't tweet that one. But there is no clear pattern to any of this. All I can say is that we are a community working together for public protection. So if we are in the space of shared purpose, which we absolutely have been and are, then it makes little sense that we will start completely from scratch with a blank sheet of paper, where it's far more likely that we're going to start working with the assets of each of the countries, which is why our conversation now is so important, and our moving closer together now is so important as part of that preparation with the regulators in the room, not aside from the regulators. It then gives us, and again, I need to bring us all back to the fact that we've all got the same common core of a framework. We've all got we may use different words, but the absolute essence of what we're saying is not different. So we're not far away from each other. So there's every possibility that whatever the future holds, that grandparenting process will be drawing upon the assets of that country to then help that to become aligned into what that future would look like. Now, clearly, I am not a regulator, and Sam is probably cringing hearing me speak at the moment, but that is the only way that we can work through any form of grandparenting. And again, the work done in England was done to do the housekeeping in anticipation of some form of regulation, or to support regulators to better utilise evidence when people are going through their revalidation processes to evidence their level of practice and their education and training underpinning. So in my mind, we are creating a transferable currency that would be available for regulators to utilise, as are the other 3 countries in different manifests, but still in a way that works for that country and the resources they have available to them, same for us. That is the essence of what we will build from. I couldn't say that with any level of assurance, but I can say that the regulators are part of our conversations, and we will continue to work collegiately together to find somewhere sensible and appropriate. And at the moment, with the opportunities for this to be stabilised, we've got to think through also, if we don't end up with further regulation, then what the countries are doing at the moment may well become the mainstay of how we are underpinning the governance of this. So clearly, any engagement in the processes that we do is down to the individual's choice, but they're deliberately and generously put out there for colleagues to enable them to work with the current processes to then have evidence for current play and whatever comes next. I hope that's suitably vague, but suitably answering the question.
I think that has. Thank you, Bev. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'll pass to Colette.
I think this is probably our last question, unfortunately, because this discussion has been really, really good today. But Bev, I think this is for you again. Can you expand on the enhanced advanced practice, the example of a radiographer that was talked about earlier?
I certainly can. So clearly, one of our colleagues summed it up beautifully earlier. We started the work right in the middle of the career framework with advanced practice because we had to, for two reasons. One is because we needed to move swiftly at the 5-year forward view stage of new models of care to pin down some of these emergent roles to start to give some framework to them. But most importantly, the definitions were required to underpin the changes to prescribing regulation, to start to underpin the next level, as was happening in 2017, the prescribing extension to other professions. So those two bits of work coincided for us to have to move into a fantastic menopausal brain. Completely forgotten the question. Give me the question again, briefly.
Sure. So could you expand on the enhanced advanced practice, the example of a radiographer?
Thank you so much. I'll write that down. So we started in the middle. If I was doing this again, it's lunacy to start in the middle of a career trajectory. If we started again, we should be building very, very firm pre-registration modernisation, underpinned then by very, very clear preceptorship and foundation preceptorship, really understanding what do the clinical and decision-making and skills development required to build. Again, in my allied health world, they come out as autonomous practitioners. We've got to build their autonomy. Midwifery have a good program running. We've got to build that autonomy so we are creating at every level confident, capable clinicians to maximise their scope of practice to the benefit of a population. Brilliant. We then have the next phase that we should have done first was that middle ground, that band 6 solidification, moving into early band 7 piece of work, which is about the enhanced practice understanding. So the real core skills of building specialisation, where we've all hiccuped around a number of different programs, but to try and create pathways that allow you to learn. And again, we'll keep in the area of radiography, for example, learn what it means to be a radiographer building specialty. So you might be doing your core underpinning development of your clinical diagnostic reasoning and then moving into your specialty. And then for the advanced practice level, stepping up again and then off into a consultant with a very clear understanding of what it is that you do at those different levels of practice. What is your scope, your level of decision making, your exercising of your autonomy through those different levels of practice. And so, for example, when the reporting of radiography started, radiography reporting was very much deemed to be an advanced practice skill. They were making an actionable decision on the basis of an X-ray, which, you could argue that's medical delegation, but they're taught about it in their pre-registration career. They're taught to take an X-ray, read an X-ray, and the beginnings of reporting an X-ray. So this is an extension of their core scope of practice into that space. The College and the Society and College of Radiography have driven this, working with the College of Radiologists, underpinning shared standards of understanding what that shared work looks like, but brokered as equal partners, not as one telling the other how to do it. Some very, very good work has happened in that space. And so where radiographers in the past would have been reporting radiographers at advanced practice level, because we are stepping up the support workforce, stepping up the students through reform, supporting better preceptorship, we then move to a point, and this is all happening now, it's not happened, it's happening now as we speak. The enhanced practice radiographer now are reporting radiographers. So that allows us now to step up advanced practice, and the college is working with the profession to support the understanding of that specialty doesn't make level of practice. Specialty means I work in a certain environment or a certain clinical area. What matters is a level of practice that you're operating at. And so there's some work happening at the moment with radiography to understand how that how we support those whose work now looks like an enhanced level of practice, then evidence there and step up there at advanced practice capabilities so that they are able to be driving forwards increasing levels of practice and driving then towards consultant practice, working in partnership within integrated imaging teams. And I need to be really clear that this is not medical substitution. This is integrated imaging teams using the scope of practice of those different professions. The thought of substitution is offensive to both those parties because they're different. They're unique professions operating and exercising their clinical skills in their specialty area. And it is, you would see that mirrored across every single specialty of nursing, every single specialty within the other professions, of the need to be able to specialise and stabilise in your profession. But there'll also be enhanced practice offerings that cut across. It might be dementia, it might be frailty, because that's what services are needing. Absolutely get that. But somewhere, somehow, we have to learn to be the professional that we are. You can only really start to understand and start to build and move your professional abilities once you've understood what it means to be a highly skilled, whatever you are, pharmacist, working in your environment, doing what you do as a pharmacist, and then you can do more, or a physio, or a nurse, or a midwife. We've got to make sure we aren't creating too much synergy too early in careers, that we never learn to be who we are and do what we do well. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're creating sludge. And our duty is to create a workforce good enough for my mum, your loved one, yourself. And if we aren't doing that, the workforce we're creating is not good enough. And that's our challenge, people. That's a way to end, hey?
Thank you so absolutely. We'll end on that note. Absolutely. Thank you so much to all our panel members. That's been an absolutely great discussion. But we're going to have to move now to coffee time. So thanks so much for taking part in this discussion, and hopefully everybody's really enjoyed that and it's given some food for thought.